Imagine walking barefoot across 1,000 miles of scorching desert, your back bent under 70 pounds of seashells, knowing that one wrong turn means death. And all of this just to make someone you've never met feel wealthy. That's not a nightmare. That's Tuesday for a trader in medieval America, where ordinary people risked everything to connect worlds that had no idea the other existed. Before Europeans ever thought about sailing west, before Columbus was even a twinkle in his great-great-grandfather's eye, there were highways crisscrossing the Americas that would make a modern logistics company weep with envy. We're talking about trade networks so sophisticated, so mind-bogglingly complex, that a macaw feather from the jungles of Mexico could end up decorating a ceremony in what we now call Colorado, and a copper bell from Arizona might jingle in the markets of ancient Mexico City. These weren't simple walking paths between neighboring villages. These were economic superhighways connecting cultures separated by distances that would take months to travel. Let me paint you a picture. It's a scorching morning in the Sonoran Desert, sometime around the year 1200. A trader named something we'll never know, let's call him Swift Fox because that sounds cool, is checking his sandals for the 1,000th time. He's about to lead a caravan of 30 people northward, carrying ceramic vessels so beautiful they look like they were kissed by gods, along with brightly colored macaw feathers that cost more than most people earned in a year. His destination? A pueblo settlement nearly 600 miles away, where people have never seen the ocean but are absolutely obsessed with seashells. Why? Because rarity creates value, my friends, and nothing says I'm important, quite like wearing something from a place you can't even imagine. The scale of these trade networks is absolutely bonkers. We're talking about connections that stretched from the Great Lakes down to Central America, from the Pacific coast to the Gulf of Mexico. Archaeologists have found shells from the Gulf of California in burial mounds in Ohio. Let that sink in for a moment. Someone carried those shells approximately 2,000 miles, passing them through dozens of hands across mountain ranges, deserts, rivers, and plains. No horses, no wheels for transportation, just feet, boats, and an incredible amount of determination. But here's where it gets really interesting, and I mean the kind of interesting that makes you want to grab a stranger and yell, "Did you know this?" The people doing this trading weren't just exchanging goods. They were exchanging ideas, technologies, art styles, religious beliefs, and probably some absolutely legendary gossip. Imagine being a kid in a small farming village, and suddenly a group of traders arrives with stories about cities of 10,000 people, pyramids that touch the sky, and markets where you can buy chocolate. Yes, chocolate was a thing, and it was serious business. The most powerful trade network in medieval America was probably the one controlled by the people at Chaco Canyon, in what's now New Mexico. These folks built massive stone structures that required millions of pieces of precisely cut sandstone, transported from quarries miles away. But that's not the impressive part. The impressive part is that they were importing huge wooden beams from forests over 50 miles away, in an environment where trees were incredibly precious. Why would they do something so crazy expensive? To show off, to demonstrate power, to say, we're so wealthy we can afford to build with materials that don't even exist near us. And the Chaco people weren't just importing construction materials. Oh no, they wanted their chocolate from Central America, their macaws from the tropical south, their turquoise from local mines that they controlled like Fort Knox, and their seashells from both the Pacific and Gulf coasts. Their trade network extended like a spider web, with Chaco at the center, and threads reaching out in every direction for hundreds of miles. They built special roads, Actual engineered roads, not just trails, that were up to 30 feet wide and stretched for hundreds of miles in perfectly straight lines. Some of these roads went straight over cliffs and mesas, requiring stairs to be carved into solid rock. Why make roads so straight when going around would be easier? Nobody knows for sure, but imagine the message that sends. Our roads don't bend for mountains. Mountains bend for our roads. Now, you might be wondering what people were actually trading for all this stuff. Great question. The economy ran on a wild mix of practical goods and luxury items. Turquoise was huge, like the cryptocurrency of medieval America. This beautiful blue-green stone was mined primarily in the American Southwest, and people went absolutely mad for it. Artisans would create intricate jewelry, small animal figurines, and decorative items that were traded far and wide. A single turquoise pendant could buy you enough corn to feed your family for months. Then there was obsidian, which is basically volcanic glass that can be chipped into blades sharper than modern surgical steel. Different regions had different types of obsidian with distinct colors and qualities, and archaeologists can actually trace where specific obsidian artifacts came from by analyzing their chemical composition. They've found obsidian from central Mexico in sites throughout the American Southwest, meaning someone carried that stuff over 1,000 miles. Why? Because a good obsidian blade was worth its weight in, well, turquoise, probably, since gold wasn't really used as currency in most of these cultures. Speaking of things that blow your mind, let's talk about the macaw situation. Macaws are these gorgeous, large parrots with bright red, blue, and yellow feathers that live in tropical climates. The people in the desert Southwest loved them. I mean, they were obsessed. They didn't just want the feathers, though those were valuable enough. They wanted living macaws. Archaeologists have found macaw breeding facilities at multiple sites in what's now New Mexico and Arizona, hundreds of miles north of where these birds naturally live. Imagine the logistics of this. Someone had to capture macaws in the tropics, keep them alive during a months-long journey through deserts and mountains, deliver them to pueblos in the north, and then those people had to figure out how to keep tropical birds alive in a high desert environment. And they succeeded. They bred them, raised them, and harvested their feathers for ceremonial use. This wasn't just trade. This was hardcore dedication to fashion. The California coast had its own thing going. The Chumash people, who lived in the area around present-day Santa Barbara, were master canoe builders and ocean traders. They built plank canoes called tommels that could hold multiple people and travel across serious ocean distances. They were trading with the Channel Islands and up and down the coast, exchanging fish, shells, beads, and other goods. But here's the kicker. They were making Shell-Bead money, actual currency. They would harvest specific types of shells, shape them into disc beads with holes in the middle, string them together, and use them as standardized units of exchange. Different lengths of bead strings had different values, just like how we have different denominations of currency today. This system was so successful that their Shell-Bead money was used by tribes far inland who never even saw the ocean. Now, all this trading required some serious social infrastructure. You couldn't just walk into a strange village carrying valuable goods and expect everything to be cool. You needed relationships, trust, and probably some kind of trading protocols or agreements. Many societies developed formal systems for this. Some groups had designated trader families or clans who had the right to travel through different territories. Others used a kind of sponsorship system, where travelers would be hosted and protected by families in each village they passed through. Breaking these trading agreements was serious business, the kind of thing that could start wars. The Mississippian culture, centered around Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was another major player in these networks. At its peak around the year 1100, Cahokia was home to maybe 15,000 to 20,000 people, making it larger than London at the same time. This was a city with massive earthen mounds, some over 100 feet tall, serving as bases for temples and elite residences. The largest mound, Monk's Mound, has a base larger than the Great Pyramid of Egypt, and Cahokia wasn't built in some lush, resource-rich paradise. It was in the Mississippi River floodplain, which meant they had to manage floods, organize massive construction projects, and coordinate complex agriculture. How did they do it? Trade, baby. Trade, and probably some pretty intense social hierarchy and religious authority. Cahokia was at the center of a trade network that extended throughout the Mississippi River Valley and beyond. They were importing copper from the Great Lakes region, which they crafted into elaborate ceremonial objects. They were getting mica from the Appalachian Mountains, which they cut into thin sheets to create shimmering decorative items. They were trading for special types of stone to make ceremonial weapons and ritual objects. And they were exporting their own goods, pottery, specialized tools, and probably agricultural products. The city's strategic location on the Mississippi River made it a natural trading hub. Canoes loaded with goods could travel up and down the river, connecting the Great Lakes with the Gulf of Mexico. Let me tell you about something that still puzzles archaeologists: the sheer variety of exotic goods found at some sites. At one burial in Cahokia, they found someone interred with over 20,000 shell beads, sheets of mica, chunky stone discs, copper objects, and other valuables. 20,000 shell beads. Do you know how long it would take to make 20,000 shell beads with stone tools? Forever. That's how long. This wasn't just wealth. This was a statement about power and connection. This person had access to trade networks spanning thousands of miles. They could acquire materials from the Atlantic, the Gulf, the Great Lakes, and the Rockies. That's not just being rich. That's being the medieval American equivalent of an international billionaire. The really fascinating thing is how different cultures developed specialized products that became their calling card in the trade networks. The people of the Hohokam culture in southern Arizona became master craftspeople for shell jewelry. They imported shells from the Gulf of California and created intricate carved bracelets, pendants, and other items that were traded throughout the region. The ancestral Puebloans in the Four Corners area became known for their beautiful pottery, with different communities developing distinctive styles. Some Rio Grande pueblos became specialists in cotton textiles. Yes, cotton was grown in the prehistoric Southwest, and textiles were major trade items, though few survive because organic materials decompose. Now, here's something that'll make you rethink everything you thought you knew about pre-Columbian America. There's evidence that traders from Mesoamerica, the area of present-day Mexico and Central America, where the Maya and Aztec civilizations developed, were traveling into what's now the United States, and traders from the north were heading south. We're not talking about occasional adventurous travelers. We're talking about regular, established trade routes. How do we know? Because archaeologists keep finding stuff that has no business being where it is. For example, there are ball courts in Arizona that are clearly influenced by Mesoamerican ball games. There are copper bells made using Mesoamerican techniques found throughout the Southwest. There are macaws, which we already talked about, but also scarlet macaw feathers worked into textiles using Mesoamerican weaving techniques. Most mind-blowing of all, there's evidence of cacao, chocolate, at sites in New Mexico. Cacao only grows in tropical climates, and the nearest place it could have come from is over 1,000 miles south in central Mexico. Someone was importing chocolate to the desert, and honestly, I respect that level of commitment to good food. The trade routes themselves were incredible achievements. Some followed natural features like rivers and mountain passes. The Rio Grande served as a natural north-south highway. The Colorado River was another major route. Coastal paths followed the Pacific shoreline. But traders also created routes through seemingly impossible terrain. There are ancient trails through the Rocky Mountains, across vast stretches of desert, and through dense forests. Some of these routes required extensive knowledge of water sources, safe camping locations, and seasonal weather patterns. A trader needed to know where to find water in the desert, which mountain passes were open at what times of year, and where they might encounter friendly or hostile groups. What's absolutely fascinating is that these networks were maintained for centuries. We're not talking about flash-in-the-pan trading fads. Some of these routes and relationships lasted for hundreds of years, passed down through generations of traders. Can you imagine that? Your great-great-great-grandfather traded with a family 500 miles away, and now you're making the same journey, staying with the descendants of his trading partners, maintaining relationships that span centuries. That's a level of social continuity that's hard to wrap your head around. Now, I've been talking a lot about luxury goods and long-distance exotic trade, but we should also mention the everyday stuff. Most trade was actually pretty local and involved practical items. Salt was a major trade good. Everyone needs salt, but not everyone lives near a salt source. Dried fish from coastal areas was traded inland. Obsidian for tools and weapons moved from volcanic regions to places without access to good stone. Pottery was traded between regions that specialized in different styles. Baskets, textiles, leather goods, dried meat, nuts, medicinal plants. All of this stuff moved through local and regional trade networks. The exotic long-distance trade in luxury goods gets all the attention because it's more dramatic, but the everyday exchange of practical goods was probably more important for most people's lives. But let's be real, the luxury stuff is more fun to talk about. Let me tell you about the turquoise trade specifically, because it's wild. The major turquoise sources were in what's now New Mexico, Colorado, and Nevada. But turquoise artifacts have been found throughout North America and deep into Mesoamerica. The stone was mined, often from difficult-to-access deposits, then shaped, polished, and crafted into jewelry and other items by specialized artisans. Different regions had different turquoise working styles, and the really skilled craftspeople could produce items of stunning beauty and complexity. Tiny turquoise beads, smaller than a grain of rice, mosaic inlays, carved animal figurines. These items could be worth enormous amounts in trade. Here's a question for you. If you could go back in time and join one of these trading expeditions, which route would you choose? Would you want to brave the desert carrying seashells north, paddle down the Mississippi with copper goods, or risk the mountain passes with a backpack full of turquoise? And more importantly, what modern convenience would you miss the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I'm genuinely curious what sounds most appealing to you folks. Let me tell you about the human side of this, because all these trade goods and routes are meaningless without the people who made it happen. Being a long-distance trader in medieval America was not for the weak. You were away from home for months at a time, walking 15 or 20 miles a day through difficult terrain, carrying heavy loads, sleeping on the ground, eating whatever you brought or could find along the way, dealing with extreme weather, and hoping that the people you met were friendly. And yet, people did it. Generation after generation, people chose this life or were chosen for it by their communities. Why would someone become a trader? Well, for some it was probably family tradition. In many societies, Certain families or clans had trading rights and responsibilities passed down through generations. For others, it might have been a way to gain wealth and status. A successful trader could acquire goods that would make them influential in their home community. Some people were probably just adventurous, the kind of folks who hear about distant places and think, "I want to see that," instead of, "That sounds terrifying." And in many cases, becoming a trader meant gaining knowledge. Traders were often sources of information, news, and stories. They knew what was happening in distant places. They understood different languages and customs, and they could navigate complex social situations. That kind of cultural knowledge was valuable. The traders also served as cultural ambassadors, whether they intended to or not. When a Mississippian trader showed up at a Great Lakes settlement, they brought more than just copper tools to trade. They brought stories about the massive city they came from. They demonstrated different clothing styles and personal decorations. They maybe taught some words in their language. They shared songs or stories. Over time, this kind of cultural exchange could lead to the spread of religious ideas, artistic styles, technological innovations, and social practices. Many archaeologists believe that religious movements spread through these trade networks, carrying new ceremonies, beliefs, and ritual practices from region to region. Speaking of religion, many of these trade goods had deep spiritual significance. Turquoise wasn't just pretty, it was sacred to many southwestern peoples, associated with the sky and with specific deities. Seashells were connected to water, fertility, and the underworld in various belief systems. Macaw feathers were used in ceremonies and were believed to have spiritual power. Copper objects were often placed in burials or used in rituals. When you traded for these items, you weren't just making an economic transaction. You were engaging with a complex web of spiritual and social meanings. The trade networks also had darker aspects that we should acknowledge. Where there's wealth and power, there's usually conflict. Control over trade routes and access to valuable resources could lead to violence. Some sites show evidence of warfare, and controlling strategic locations along trade routes was probably a factor in some of these conflicts. There's also evidence that not everyone benefited equally from trade. The concentration of exotic goods in certain burials and elite residences suggests that access to long-distance trade networks was often controlled by powerful families or social classes. The trader, carrying 70 pounds of seashells across the desert, probably wasn't getting rich. They were working for someone who was. We also need to talk about what happened to these networks. Many of them collapsed or changed dramatically in the centuries before European contact. Chaco Canyon was abandoned. Cahokia declined and was eventually emptied. Various Pueblo sites were deserted. The reasons are complex and debated, but likely included environmental changes like droughts, resource depletion, social upheaval, and possibly violence. When major centers collapsed, the trade networks that depended on them often fell apart too. By the time Europeans arrived, the landscape of North American trade had changed significantly. Some networks persisted and continued. Native peoples were still trading across vast distances when Europeans showed up, but the peak of these medieval trade systems had passed. If you've been enjoying learning about these historical videos and the incredible stories of how our ancestors connected distant worlds through courage, determination, and pure hustle, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to History Candle YouTube channel. It really helps us keep bringing you these fascinating forgotten stories. The legacy of these trade networks is still visible today if you know where to look. Many modern highways and roads follow routes that were established by Native American traders centuries ago. Cultural connections between tribal nations often reflect ancient trading relationships. And the archaeological sites scattered across the Americas contain countless artifacts that testify to these vast networks of exchange. Every time archaeologists find a seashell in Colorado, an obsidian blade in Mississippi, or a copper bell in Arizona, they're seeing evidence of someone's journey, someone's hard work, someone's dream of connecting distant peoples and making a living doing it. What's really humbling is how much we still don't know. Written records don't exist for most of these cultures, so we're piecing together the story from archaeology, oral histories, and educated guesswork. We can see what was traded, and sometimes where it came from and where it ended up, but we don't always know how it got there, who carried it, what they thought about their journeys, what stories they told around campfires at night. We don't know the names of the traders, the details of their lives, the relationships they built. We're looking at the bones of these networks without always being able to see the living, breathing reality that animated them. But here's what we do know. For hundreds of years before European contact, the Americas were connected by vast networks of trade that spanned thousands of miles. Ordinary people, using nothing but their feet, boats, and determination, created economic systems that moved goods, ideas, and culture across distances that would challenge modern logistics companies. They did this without wheels for transportation, without pack animals in many cases, without written contracts or international banking or any of the tools we think of as necessary for large-scale commerce. They did it through memory, through relationships, through passed-down knowledge of routes and customs, through trust built over generations. These trade networks remind us that human societies have always been connected, always been exchanging and influencing each other. The idea of isolated, unchanging traditional societies is a myth. People have always been curious about what's over the next hill, always been interested in exotic goods and new ideas, always been willing to take risks to make connections with distant strangers. The medieval American trade networks were just as sophisticated, just as economically important, and just as culturally significant as the famous trade routes of Europe and Asia during the same period. The Silk Road gets all the attention in history books, but while merchants were moving silk and spices between China and Rome, there was a whole other set of epic trading journeys happening across the Americas. So the next time you hear someone talk about pre-Columbian America as if it was a simple, primitive place, remember the trader walking across the desert with seashells, the canoe paddler carrying copper down the Mississippi, the craftsperson in Chaco Canyon working imported turquoise into jewelry, the macaw breeder keeping tropical birds alive in the desert. Remember the 1,000-mile journeys, the relationships maintained across generations, the roads built straight over mountains, and the 20,000 shell-beads buried with a single person in Cahokia. These weren't simple societies. These were complex civilizations with sophisticated economies, extensive trade networks, and people just as smart, ambitious, and capable as anyone alive today. The medieval American trade networks prove something important about human nature. We've always been explorers and traders, always been willing to risk everything to make connections across vast distances, always been drawn to the exotic and the rare. Those traders walking across deserts and paddling down rivers weren't that different from modern international business travelers, really. Different technology, same human drive to connect, exchange, and profit from bridging distant worlds. And they did it carrying everything on their backs, one step at a time, across a continent that seemed endless. That's not just history, that's inspiration. If you enjoyed diving into this forgotten chapter of history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to History Candle YouTube channel. so we can keep exploring these amazing untold stories together.